Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a look at VRM thermal performance once again, and we're doing so with 9 Z690 motherboards. They are priced between $200 and $300 US, and unfortunately that price range can be considered entry level for Z690, which is a bit of a problem for Alder Lake, especially the more affordable models like the Core i5-12600K, but for now at least, this is the situation. Today's video is brought to you by the Thermaltake Argent E700 gaming chair. Designed by Studio FA Porsche, the E700 is an ergonomic chair with diverse adjustment options to perfectly support your body. Featuring high-quality materials like genuine leather and aluminium, the E700 combines the best of both worlds, gorgeous aesthetics and peak functionality. And it comes in 6 stunning color options. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so getting back to it. Given that Z690 motherboards are very expensive, you really want to make sure that the board you're buying isn't hot garbage. And as we found with the previous generation Z590 motherboards, that can indeed be the case. And yes, I am looking at you, ASRock. On that note, there are no ASRock motherboards featured in this roundup, and that's not because we're deliberately ignoring ASRock, but rather because we're still blacklisted by the company for accurate and honest reporting on the performance of their products. Normally, we just go ahead and buy their boards, and we will, but for whatever reason, their most entry-level models are yet to go on sale. I've gone ahead and pre-ordered the usual offenders, such as the Phantom Gaming, for example, but they're not due to arrive until mid-December, so they'll get their own special dedicated video. As for the rest of the boards, all were provided by the manufacturer, with the exception of the Asus Prime Z690 PD4. For whatever reason, Asus refused to sample that board, and it sounded like Asus HQ didn't have that much faith in their own product, so I've gone ahead and purchased it. And thankfully, we're able to do so in time for this content. And I've gone and made a point of noting this because I really don't like it when these companies are happy to sell you guys products, but then do their best to make sure they never get tested. But thanks to our Floatplane and Patreon members, we have a workaround, and Asus knows this, so I don't get why they try and make it difficult, but I'm sure they have their reasons. Anyway, let's get started by quickly going over the boards that we'll be looking at, starting with the Asus models. So from Asus, in the $220 to $300 US price range, we have the Prime Z690 PD4 at $220, the Tough Gaming Z690 Plus Wi-Fi D4 at $290, so quite a big jump up there in price, and then the Prime Z690A D5 at $300. So you can see why I wanted to buy the Z690 PD4, because it is significantly cheaper than the other two boards that Asus provided. Also, one of the high-end boards they provided, the Prime Z690A, there is no DDR4 variant. So for now, this board doesn't really make any sense, but we'll cover it anyway because at some point DDR5 memory will become available, surely, and hopefully it'll be available at a reasonable price. The Prime Z690 PD4 entry-level offering comes in either a DDR4 or DDR5 version, and both use 14 Vishay SiC 65450A power stages for the V-Core, and this is one of the weakest VRMs you'll find on an ATX Z690 motherboard. That said, it is still very capable, so it should be interesting to see how it tackles the Core i9-1200K. Then we have the Asus Tough Gaming Z690 Plus Wi-Fi D4, and this has been substantially upgraded in terms of V-Core VRM, as it uses 14 Vishay SiC 659 80A power stages. So at face value, that's a 60% greater current handling capability. There's also a DDR5 version of this board, and it uses the same VRM. Then we have the slightly more expensive Prime Z690A, which is a DDR5 only model and it uses Vishay's slightly weaker SiC 643 60A power stages, but there are 16 of them in total. So the more expensive Asus models look good, and the entry-level model should be decent. Now, from Gigabyte, we have the Z690 UD-AX DDR4 at $220, though there are 5 versions of this board, but all use the same VRM, so the thermal results here will apply to all 5 models. Now, making up the V-Core portion of the VRM is 16 onsemi NCP 303160 60A power stages, which aren't the greatest power stages, but there are a lot of them, so this budget Z690 board should perform quite well. Then for $10 more, they also have the Z690 Gaming X DDR4, and there are 2 versions of this model, the DDR4 version that we have here, as well as a DDR5 variant, and this time they do differ in VRM design. Again, both feature 16 power stages for the V-Core using 60A models, but whereas the DDR4 version uses the same on-semi power stages as the UD version, the DDR5 model has been upgraded to DRMOS 60A power stages. Unfortunately though, I don't have the DDR5 model for testing, and it's unavailable for purchase in Australia at this point in time, but presumably it will be better than the DDR4 version that we'll be testing here today. Then at $270, we have the Z690 Aorus Elite AX DDR4, and there are half a dozen versions of this board, which is extremely confusing. The two micro ATX motherboards are pretty easy to distinguish because they're MATX boards, and they feature just a dozen 60-amp power stages for the V-Core. I'm not sure what model power stages we're talking about here, as Gigabyte are hopeless at giving this information. I've asked multiple times, but yeah, didn't get the information in time for this video. And really, you do have more chance of finding out what VRM components Gigabyte uses on their motherboards by asking anyone but Gigabyte. Hopefully that is a situation that we can rectify, work to improve in the near future, because it would be good to be able to get accurate information from Gigabyte. Anyway, the micro ATX boards might be a bit on the weak side, but without knowing the exact power stages, it's hard to say. As for the ATX boards, we have the Aorus Elite and Aorus Elite AX. Both are available in either a DDR4 or DDR5 version. It is worth noting though that the DDR4 models use different VRM components to the DDR5 versions, and interestingly, that means while the DDR4 version that I have uses 16 on-semi FDM F5062 70-amp power stages with a V-Core, the DDR5 model uses DRMOS 60-amp power stages. Again, not sure on the exact models used here, and I don't have the boards, so I can't check. And again, Gigabyte wasn't able to give us that information for whatever reason. Now, the MSI Z690 lineup is by far the most coherent, and therefore, in my opinion, most consumer-friendly. At the bottom of the stack is the Z690A Pro Wi-Fi DDR4 for $220 US, and this board can be purchased with or without Wi-Fi support, and either option is available in a DDR4 or DDR5 variant. So there's something there for everyone, and it means there are 4 variants in total. The good news being that all 4 feature the same 14 power stage V-Core VRM using Alpha and Omega AOZ5016QI, 55 amp power stages. Then we have the Z690 Torpedo for $280, and like the Asus Prime Z690A, this board unfortunately only supports DDR5 memory, which is a bit awkward in the current market. There's 2 versions of the Torpedo, the version we have for testing, and then one with a custom EK water block, though I haven't seen that model out in the wild yet. Both feature a 16-phase V-Core using MPS MP87992 70-amp power stages, and this is the same VRM configuration found on the slightly more expensive $300 Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4, which I've also included in this video. There's just 2 versions of the Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi, one with DDR4 and one with DDR5, and thankfully both feature the exact same VRM design. So that's the MSI lineup between $200 and $300 US. Pretty simple, especially in terms of VRM design, as we're looking at just 2 different configurations. But before we get into the graphs, let's talk about the test conditions as well as the test system. For this test and any future LJ1700 VRM thermal testing, I've built a dedicated system inside the Corsair iQ7000X case. And then powering it, we have the Corsair HX1000 power supply. And then for cooling, the Corsair iQ H170i Elite Capelix. The iQ7000X has been configured with a single rear 140mm exhaust fan and then 3 140mm intake fans, so that is the stock configuration for this case. Then in the top of the case, we have the H170i 420mm radiator with 3 140mm exhaust fans. This is a very good high-end configuration. Airflow will be exceptionally good, and in a 21-degree room, I'd say this is an optimal setup. For recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'll be reporting the peak rear PCB temperature. But please note, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient. Instead, I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, which is crucial for this testing. And to ensure a constant ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. Now for this testing, I've got 3 configurations using 3 different 12th gen processors, and given that there's only 3 CPUs available right now, excluding the F variants, it won't shock you to learn that I've tested with the Core i9 12900K, Core i7 12700K, and Core i5 12600K. As for the stress testing, I'm using Cinebench R23, which has been looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again using K-type thermocouples. Starting with the Core i9 12900K results, we find the Asus Prime Z690A at the top of our graph with a peak temperature of just 60 degrees, and this same temperature was also achieved by the Tough Gaming Z690 Plus Wi-Fi D4. The MSI Z690 Tomahawk was also up there, basically matching the Asus boards with a temperature of 61 degrees. Quite surprisingly, the Asus Prime Z690P, so that's the motherboard that we had to purchase that Asus didn't want to send out, it also performed exceptionally well. So I have no idea why Asus wanted to exclude this board from our testing. Perhaps they want to push potential buyers towards the more expensive models. Really not sure on that one, but I am glad to discover that this board does work very well. The MSI Z690 Torpedo also performed very well, though this is a DDR5 only model, so it has limited appeal right now. Then the Gigabyte Z690 motherboards, they were quite disappointing, unfortunately. Despite turning in a satisfactory result, they certainly did work well enough, just not as good as competing boards. The Z690 Aorus Elite AX DDR4, for example, it reached 74 degrees, and that made it quite a bit hotter than competing boards from MSI and Asus. Interestingly, the Aorus Elite was barely any better than the Gaming X and UD, so I'm not sure what the limitation is here for Gigabyte, but all boards ran in the mid-70s, making them 10 to 15 degrees hotter than most competing models. The only exception here being, of course, is the MSI and Asus entry-level boards, so the Z690A Pro and Prime Z690P D4, both of which hit 74 to 75 degrees. So a passable result, and as good as it gets for $200-ish Z690 motherboards. I'd just like to note that despite the variation in package power, all boards did run and maintain a P-core frequency of 4.9 GHz, and none of these motherboards were power limited in any way out of the box. But because the new Alder Lake CPUs are quite complex, I've also included the Cinebench R23 scores after the 60-minute stress test. As you can see, we're looking at no more than a 0.3% variation in score between the various motherboards, so performance was identical across all boards. The thermal margin between the best and worst boards shrunk quite considerably when using the Core i7-12700K. Here we're looking at no more than a 10-degree difference. Again, the Asus Prime Z690A and Tough Gaming Z690 Plus Wi-Fi D4 delivered the best results. Then we have the MSI Z690 Tomahawk and Torpedo, followed by the Z690A Pro. Then oddly, at the bottom of the graph are the 3 Gigabyte boards, all of which peaked at just 60 degrees. Now you might find it a bit odd that these Gigabyte boards all hit the same peak temperature, given they do use different VRM components, but I did retest this, and even using the onboard sensors, they all peaked at the same 68 degrees. I should note though that I don't report the onboard sensors as they're placed in different locations on different boards. They use different offsets, so the results will vary from board to board, and it's not an apples to apples way of testing like we do with the K-type thermocouples. But it was interesting to see that these 3 Gigabyte boards all hit the same internal temp sensor value as they did using the K-type thermocouples. That value was just 8 degrees hotter using the onboard sensor. Then finally, with the Core i5-12600K, we're looking at up to a 6-degree difference between the best and worst boards. Of course, at this point, VRM temperatures are no longer relevant as all boards ran within safe limits. So at least when picking from this bunch, any board will work just fine with the 12600K, even in a warm climate. And really the same is also true when paired with the Core i7-12700K. So there you have it. Surprisingly solid results for the Prime Z690P D4, and that is despite Asus not wanting to send it out. And I've got to say, based on that, I was expecting it to be a bit trash, but thankfully it is a decent budget board. The MSI Z690A Pro Wi-Fi and Gigabyte Z690 UD AX DDR4 are arguably better, but there's certainly nothing wrong with the Asus board, assuming that pricing and availability is competitive in your region. The good news being that all boards tested worked even with the most high-end LGA 1700 processor, and we're a long way off hitting PCB temperatures of 100 degrees. So performance was acceptable across the board, you could say. And I should just note that with this VRM thermal testing, we're not looking for the absolute best board. We don't care if one board's a few degrees better than the other board. That shouldn't be a deciding factor when purchasing your motherboard. We just want to make sure these boards operate their VRM within an acceptable temperature range, and that is certainly the case for all of the boards tested here. Now, where the Asus Prime Z690 PD4 falls apart just a little bit is when looking beyond the VRM temperatures and instead turning your attention towards features. It's not exactly stacked here. On the I/O panel, you'll find just half a dozen USB ports, 2 less than the MSI Z690A Pro and 4 less than the Gigabyte Z690 UD. You also get 1 less M.2 slot than the Z690A Pro and 2 less SATA ports. So features-wise, the MSI and Gigabyte boards are certainly better, and really it's going to come down to what you're prioritizing here. There's also the Gigabyte Z690 Gaming X DDR4 for $230, which is a really nice looking board at this price point, especially if you don't need Wi-Fi. As for the rest of the boards, they're all priced at or very close to $300, and the weaker VRM thermal performance of the Gigabyte Z690 or Elite AX DDR4 makes it a lot less appealing at this price point. Then you have the Asus Prime Z690A and MSI Z690 Torpedo, which only support DDR5 memory. So right now, they're probably going to be off the table for most of you, given the availability issues with DDR5 and then, of course, the extreme pricing. And that leaves the Asus Tough Gaming Z690 Plus Wi-Fi D4 and the MSI Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4. In terms of VRM thermals, they were much the same, so no real winner here. Again, we're not looking for the absolute best in terms of VRM thermal performance. Both of these boards were very acceptable when it came to temperatures. They're also very similar feature-wise with comparable I/O connectivity. They both offer Wi-Fi 6, 2.5 gigabit LAN, 4M.2 slots, and a pre-installed I/O shield. The Tomahawk does come with 2 extra SATA ports and an additional full-length PCIe x16 slot, which could be quite handy, though it's only wired for 4 times bandwidth as expected. Overall, though, they are very similar, so it's really going to come down to pricing and availability in your region. And that is going to do it for our first look at Z690 VRM thermal performance of ATX boards priced between $200 and $300 US. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and there'll be a few more Z690 motherboard videos coming up on the channel over the next few weeks or so. So yeah, if you want to see those, make sure you are subscribed. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, get some awesome perks in return, then we do have Float Plane or Patreon. That'll ensure that we can buy any boards we need to that for some reason manufacturers don't want to send them out. That always seems to happen. And yeah, you get cool perks in return. So we have an exclusive Discord server, great community over there. Tim and I get together and do live streams each month for you guys, behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, check it out. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. I'll see you again next time.